Hello, this is Carl Danneberger. In a series of presentations, we will look at the golden age of golf course design, the 1920s. But as a backdrop, in this presentation, we will look at the time, the 1920s, and two prominent golfers of the decade, Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen. A year after Francis Ouimet's historical victory over Harry Vardon and Ted Ray in the 1913 U.S. Open, Europe was involved in the Great War, or as it's known as World War I. At the beginning of World War I, the United States remained neutral, while President Woodrow Wilson tried to broker a deal to end the war with Germany. But in the spring of 1917, the United States entered the war against the Germans and the Central Powers. The entry of the Americans into the war turned the tide, and by the fall of 1918, the Central Powers crumbled and finally surrendered. Of the almost 5 million men who served in the military during World War I, 2.8 million were drafted. A total of 1.4 million Americans saw combat, with 53,000 Americans killed and 200,000 injured. Many of the deaths were due to the worldwide influenza pandemic that was occurring at the time. The 1920s saw unprecedented economic growth, reflected by industrial growth, technology, and aspirations by millions of Americans for a better life, especially after the horrors of World War I. It was also the time of modernity and the rise of Art Deco, which reflected glamour, elegance, and being modern. The 1920s saw the rise of women's rights. The flapper was a woman who wore a short skirt, bobbed her hair, and listened to jazz, which was the music of the era, was the new or modern woman of the time. It was the time of Prohibition and the speakeasies. It was also the time for the lost generation, who were young people who came out of World War I disillusioned and cynical about the world and the focus on material things. Famous members included and wrote about the time were F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. The 1920s was also the time when sports came into their own. College teams formed with famous football players like the Four Horsemen at Notre Dame University under the coach Knute Rockne and the Galloping Ghost, Red Grange, at the University of Illinois. The 1927 New York Yankees is considered the greatest team of all time. Their lineup, which included Combs, Ruth, Gehrig, Musial, and Lazzari, was known as the Murderers' Row. They all batted over 300, led by Gehrig at 373. Ruth, Gehrig, Lazzari finished 1, 2, and 3 in homers, with 60, 47, and 18 respectively. Ruth's 60 home runs in 1 year was a record that was not broken until 1961. It was also the golden age for golf. Bobby Jones, who was probably the first junior phenom in golf. He played in the U.S. Amateur at the age of 14, and through the 1970 to 1919 played fundraising events for the war effort. Bobby Jones won his first major championship, the U.S. Open, in 1923, and was able to win 13 major championships in 20 attempts until he retired in 1930 after winning the U.S. Amateur at Merion. In 1930, he won what was considered the Grand Slam of golf, which was winning the U.S. Open, the U.S. Amateur, the Open, and the British Open in 1 year. Supposedly prior to the start of the 1930 season, he made a wager on himself with British bookies, giving odds on winning the Grand Slam were set at 50 to 1. His bet won him $60,000. After winning the Grand Slam, he retired at the age of 28 and made movies with Hollywood stars on golf. These movies would be played in theaters as a lead-up to the main movie. The movies were especially profitable for him. Upon signing his contract, he sent a letter, no press conference, no big show, informing the USGA that he was retiring from golf and would forfeit his amateur standing. In 1931, Bobby Jones, with the help of Clifford Roberts, purchased an old nursery outside of Augusta, Georgia for $71,000. With Alister MacKenzie, Bobby Jones co-designed Augusta National, which opened in 1933, and the Masters Tournament was started or initiated in 1934. Bobby Jones would come out of retirement to play in his own tournament, the Masters, but more as a ceremonial player than a competitor during the 1930s. During World War II, Bobby Jones served in the armed forces overseas. Augusta National at this time was converted into a pasture for the war effort. In 1948, Bobby Jones was diagnosed with syringomyelia, a spinal disorder that leads to paralysis. To give you an idea of the degenerative nature of this disease, when Bobby Jones made the Hollywood movies, he looked and spoke like a star. He was a handsome figure during the 1920s. In 1967, he did not meet with the winner of the Masters on TV because the television network thought he would be too scary for the audience. He died in Atlanta in 1971. In contrast to the amateur Bobby Jones, Walter Hagen, the professional, was the second most iconic golfer of the time. He was dashing and assertive, a real showman. He is, I believe, the first $1 million sports figure. He won the U.S. Open, the Open, and the PGA Championship 11 times. And if you include the Western Open, which was considered the fourth most important pro tournament, his total would have been 15. In the 1920s, professional golfers were not considered as good or socially as elite as the amateurs. Walter Hagen helped change this image more than anyone else, and professionals owe him a debt of gratitude. Golf professionals were often not allowed to partake of the facilities of the clubhouse and were sometimes not allowed to enter the clubhouse by the front door. On one occasion at the British Open in 1920, Hagen hired a Pierce Arrow car to serve as his private dressing room because he was refused entrance to the clubhouse dressing room. He hired a chauffeur and parked the expensive car in the club's driveway. This behavior raised the ire of the class-conscious British. On another occasion, when Walter Hagen was playing in a golf tournament, he refused to enter clubhouse to claim his prize because he had earlier been denied entrance. The 1920 U.S. Open in Toledo, Ohio at Inverness marked a turning point. At this tournament, professionals were treated with dignity and as equal and were given access to the club's facilities. The professionals, encouraged by Hagen, in 1931 donated a large grandfather clock to the host club at the time, Inverness Golf Club in Toledo, in appreciation of the club allowing access for the professionals to their clubhouse during the past tournament. The following inscription associated with the clock is shown here. Walter Hagen, who died in October of 1969 at the age of 76, had suffered from a long bout of cancer. With the writing on the wall, in 1967, his friends and admirers came to Grand Traverse, Michigan, where he was living at the time, to celebrate his life. At the banquet, letters were read and stories told, but it was Arnold Palmer, still the undisputed king of golf, who got up and spoke, finishing with the following: "If it were not for you, Walter, this dinner tonight would be downstairs in the pro shop, not in the ballroom." Arnold Palmer was one of the pallbearers for Walter Hagen. Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen got to play some of the greatest courses ever designed, the classics as they are often referred to. We will look at some of these courses and discuss some of the design philosophies in the following presentations.